how do we determine what gives a story value and whose story? And I think, what do we, like you had said earlier, we have to be careful of the stories that we tell, right? We do. But we also have to be equally careful, and Dave, you just said the stories we don't tell. Because in not telling the story, we're telling a story.
Right.
Absolutely.
That's telling its own story.
Welcome to Hallway Conversations. We're a trio of educators who have plenty of questions about teaching and learning and school culture, and we believe in the value of collaboration and reflection as we seek to keep growing as teachers. So this podcast is our place for thinking out loud together about issues in education and why they might matter to Christian educators. Welcome to the conversation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us in the hallway. My name is Matt Beamers.
I'm Abby DeGroat.
And I'm Dave Mulder with a cold. Sorry, everyone.
With the gold.
Yeah.
So
I'm usually a tenor. Today I'm a bass.
Well, you got a face for radio.
Thanks, man. Yeah, exactly right.
One of the things that we talked about last time was this idea of when we start listening to Christmas music.
Oh, that's right.
And so
Controversial.
It was more controversial, but I actually have what I think is a more controversial question. So once in a while, my friend Abby here has gifted me with the phrase, two things can be true. And I've realized in my life that there's a lot of situations where two things can be true. But I've thought of a question before we get into our talking about education, where two things can't be true. There's only one right answer to this question. And so my question for you is, fake Christmas tree or real Christmas tree? And two things cannot be true at the same time.
Okay, so now my follow-up to that is, what do you mean by a real Christmas tree? Like I have to go cut down a tree to bring it in my house? Because
something that's okay. That's
alive.
That's a great. Yeah, that is not made of plastic. Then you have to vacuum up. You have to vacuum up the needles when you don't water it enough. That fills your house with the beautiful smell of pine when you wake up in the morning.
Well, I can see which team you're on.
No, I'm totally neutral about this. But Abby, I was curious because I believe last episode on the podcast, you said you started listening to Christmas music around Labor Day or something like that.
It was not that early.
Or maybe Canadian Thanksgiving.
Pentatonics has a lot of different albums to get through.
Okay, so
you're not wrong.
So in thinking that you are you love Christmas.
I do. Yeah. We have a fake tree. And it's beautiful.
If you could see the look on Matt's face right now, he's shooting
daggers. We have had it since year one of our marriage, and it is...
This is the problem.
What?
Who puts their Christmas trees is not something you should be able to put away and take out.
But you just throw a sheet over it? I don't even take the lights off.
Oh, he's dying.
You carry it down to the basement. We moved, and I literally took it out of my storage room. My friend Brad carried it into my house, and he's like, just go downstairs. I'm like, no, put it in the corner.
Perfect. Yeah.
Put it out.
I feel like
plugged it in. Christmas.
18 months of mentoring becoming undone in simply by asking one question.
It's a gorgeous tree.
It's fake. It's not even a tree. It's not even a tree. Folks, our friend Ed Starkenberg hears us yelling. Come in here for a second, Ed. We don't have guests on the podcast.
Ed, real tree, fake
real
tree.
Tree or fake tree?
Christmas.
At my house?
Yeah.
Yeah, for Christmas tree.
Fake.
Yes.
Yeah, he's team fake.
Could you team fake? Exactly. It's a metaphor for all of them, folks. All right, we don't need you here anymore.
Dave?
You don't need me anywhere.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we have always had a fake tree.
Yeah.
We are fake tree people. So growing up, this is a funny thing. Like growing up in Southern California, where I did, we always got a real tree, and we would go to. There was a Christmas tree farm.
Ironic.
And we would go cut one down, right? And that's way too much work. I like having the fake tree.
Yeah. Matt, what do you have?
I'm beside myself right now with both of you. Like living out in the Midwest, in the cold, like in the snow. I honestly assumed everybody out here would, and I'm newer here,
I have never, ever cut down a Christmas tree. Ever.
Really?
Not in
That's sad, though. You should have sometime have the experience of cutting
You're hardly flourishing in life. I'm being very judgmental in saying that if you have never done that. So in spite of the fake Christmas tree, we're going to keep keep going. And maybe we should get into it now.
We shouldn't agree all the time.
We should. A wise person said that to me a few weeks ago. Abby, you have come today.
Yes.
The last few podcasts, we've come with a quoted. We had a David Smith quote a couple of weeks ago, then Kieran Egan quote. We talked about the power of storytelling, and Abby.
Yeah, so I changed it up a little bit, and I'm actually going to read a bit of a transcript from a TED Talk.
Okay.
And so we can maybe link it in the show notes if you want to watch the whole thing. But it's called The Danger of a Single Story. Have either of you seen it?
I think you've mentioned this one maybe once before. And I did look
so
it
I'm
up.
a big fan,
Yeah.
and I show it in several of my classes.
Yeah.
So if my students are listening, it's going to be familiar to you.
Okay.
Yep. It's by a Nigerian woman. Her name is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And the premise of this TED Talk is she grew up in Nigeria, obviously, and the only books she could get her hands on when she was a child were British and American. And she became a writer very early. And in her stories, all of her characters had blonde hair and drank ginger beer and talked about the weather.
Oh, interesting.
Because the only story she had of books was that they had little British children in them.
Sure.
Right? And so she didn't know, she had no story or no context for the fact that she could write about things that she knew from where she lived. And then she kind of takes that idea and really talks about the danger of when you have a single story for something. And I thought this was a nice also kind of continuation of our last conversation because when we talk about how story is so powerful, and I do just want to also put a little disclaimer on that. We have to be careful what stories we tell, right? And think about how the stories we tell are framing things for our students. Yeah. And so here's the quote. She has just talked about how she had actually a really happy childhood, but also living in Africa had some things happen to her that were hard, right? I had grandfathers who died in refugee camps. One of my friends died in a plane crash because our fire trucks did not have water. Things like that. And so this is what she says. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Of course, Africa is a continent full of catastrophes. There are immense ones, such as the horrific rapes in the Congo, and depressing ones, such as the fact that 5,000 people apply for one job vacancy in Nigeria. But there are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it is very important, it is just as important to talk about them. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. So that's what I want to talk about. That who do we have single stories of, right? And how does even our curriculum perpetuate single stories of different groups of people, and how can we create more fuller stories in our classrooms?
I mean, can I start by asking you a question?
Yeah.
Because you mentioned, you've showed this to your students at different times, so clearly this resonates with you, and this is important to you. So can you just start by maybe sharing a bit of your story about why this resonates with you? I'm because it's beautiful, and as I sit here, I'm like I find it poignant, I find it challenging. I'm sort of sitting actually silently, just really, wow, like this is powerful. And so I'm trying to gather my own thoughts, but maybe can you just share a bit of why it resonates with you?
I think, so my background is obviously English education, right?
Yeah.
And part of my job is I teach the English methods course to our secondary majors. So I am literally the person teaching future English teachers how to do that well.
Right.
And so I think the weight of that, of guiding those future teachers into selecting and thinking about how to frame stories for their students is really kind of why this hits me so hard, right? Yeah. So my responsibility to think about how I'm influencing not only my students, but their students in the stories and the pictures they're really forming of the world through the literature that's available to them and that they learn in school. And I think, and maybe you both agree with me, I think I had a pretty singular experience of the authors that I read being mostly white, mostly male, right? And that's formative for kids. And so I'm passionate about widening that circle a little bit and helping even my own kids, right, see God's creation and the beautiful diversity that it is and that it holds.
I'm also wondering about how do you balance exposing them to those different stories, but limiting that to a textbook or what they're reading or to content. And so I want to be really clear in saying that I think it is vitally important, and I will say out loud here, I need to do a better job of this as a professor. I need to do a better job of this, of having our students be well read in every regard. And I know I have my go-to authors, and I can name them, and we've talked about some of them. Their names come up on this podcast, and because they're really wonderful thinkers and writers, but there's also wonderful thinkers and writers out there that I need to work harder, to be honest, to find. But so I think it's vitally important that we expose our, that the students in our class are well read and why it's wide and there's depth and breadth to that. But I would push a little on that in terms of saying, is that enough? That's a starting point for me. But it, because as you talk, Abby, one of the things that I find myself thinking about, and you can maybe help me with this or even push back on it, is this idea of understanding who the other is and who my neighbor is, and I've always wondered. This is just a wonder if how much of the polarization and the disagreement that happens in the world right now is because of misunderstood worldviews or assumptions we make about who our neighbor is.
Yeah.
That we actually have way more in common with others who we think is the other, that we actually have way more in common than we do differently. And so my wonder about it is yes, and is it enough? Like, how does it, we get past a singular story but how much more do we want for them? So we get them past that. And I guess I'm thinking about myself, like, about who are our students literally rubbing shoulders with in a text, but how about in our community? How about outside of our community? Right. Because I think that for me, if I think about it in my own life, even, guys, I think about when I said, oh, like, I didn't know that about you. Or I didn't realize that. Or now we're the people that know. Boy, that doesn't mean it has to change everything, but it deepens understanding, right, of who my neighbor is, and deepens understanding of what my role is as a neighbor. So I guess I'm thinking out loud, but if I think about it as a dad, even, it's like, yes, and there's a part of me that wants even more.
Right, I agree. Yeah.
So that's my initial thinking
this
there.
Is the first step, at least, right? To broaden some of that circle.
Right.
This has me thinking again about this idea of hidden curriculum. I'm such a curriculum nerd, right? But so the formal curriculum is what we actually plan to teach, and then the enacted curriculum is what you actually teach, not the planned part. And then the hidden curriculum is all just the implicit stuff, right? The things that we don't necessarily name, but it's the kind of what we think here. Or the things that we intentionally exclude from the curriculum, right? Like all of that too.
Right.
Ooh, and this just has me, as you bring this quote to us, Abby, that has me thinking about that, right? Like, how often the what we think here, well, who's the we that we're talking about?
Yeah, interesting.
And the authors that we bring in are part of that, right? Is that is that reinforcing this mythical we, whoever we is, or is it broadening who we are?
And I've run into so many times when high school students, college students have never been taught to critically assess or analyze a text, right? And so everything that's ever been put in front of them, they've been taught to agree with and see as authority. And if that's, first of all, I think that's problematic.
Sure.
Right? Because we want our students to look at what they're reading with some critical thinking,
right,
and looking for logical fallacies and thinking about, where is this reliable, where is it unreliable, and nonfiction, but also if they've been taught that text is authority and everything they've ever read is by the same demographic of people, they have learned to associate that authority with a certain and a very limited pool of people, and so then therefore are other people not authorities for them, or are they not worth listening to, or because they're not published, or because they've never been exposed to what they've written, or
that has me thinking though, as you're saying that, right? So how do we get text in front of students then? Like, I want students to read things that I don't agree with, right? Okay, so that gets weird, because if I'm coming in as this authority figure as a teacher, and I'm going to say, here's something I want you to read because I don't agree with it, and then does that expand students' worldview, or does that pull the rug out from under them?
Right. You have to do it carefully.
Well, that's what I'm wondering, right?
Yeah.
Like, this just has me...
Well, and it also has me thinking about how do we determine what gives a story value and whose story, and I think, what do we, like you had said early in the, like, we have to be careful of the stories that we tell, right? We do. But we also have to be equally careful, and Dave, you just said the stories we don't tell. Because in not telling the story, we're telling a story.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
That's telling its own story. Last podcast we talked about this idea of being story-formed people. And ultimately we are the story of God and his people, right? It is his singular story. But there is a multitude of stories. I mean, that is the beauty of God's creation, is that it's all these stories.
Right.
That all have value, because the people in these stories have value because they're children of God.
And that truth can be found in all of these stories.
Yeah, it's interesting that in telling a singular story, are we inadvertently devaluing the richness of God's story even? Right? To say God has given us this beautiful diversity in his creation, and yet we're actually not honoring that diversity by simply telling one story.
Because what would be the analogy here, right? You think about all the flowers that God has created, all the different kinds of flowers, and we're going to say, no, there's really only one kind of flower that we're actually going to value, though, right? If it's not a red rose, it ain't nothing, right?
Yeah.
Oh, come on now, right?
Right.
No, totally.
And so we could do the same thing with the stories of different people and say, well, there's really only one kind of story that we actually value. I wonder about that, if people approach it that way.
Right, and if you think about how this plays out in curriculum, right? So history is an easy example, right? So whose history do we learn? Whose history do we never touch?
Right.
Right?
Well, I have this right now. So I'm teaching this world geography class that I teach every fall. And I asked my students in class today, we're getting towards the end of the semester, and we're starting to do some reviewing and thinking back. We look at all these different regions of the world. What were some regions of the world that you learned a lot about because you'd never studied them before? Right away they say, Central Asia. Never studied Central Asia before. It's like, okay, but Afghanistan is in Central Asia, and you should know things about Afghanistan. Like, you should. And for a lot of them, they're like, we never learned anything about this. Okay, well, there's a story that they've missed out on.
Yes, absolutely.
And now that hopefully this course was an opportunity to enrich.
The first time I learned about Afghanistan was when I read The Kite Runner.
Yeah.
I knew nothing.
Right.
As an adult.
And what a great story here again.
Such a good story.
To unveil things that you didn't realize you didn't know, right?
Totally.
That's the problem. We don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
No.
Like, we know the things we know, and we know there are things we don't know, but we don't know the things we don't know.
Right.
Yeah. But I also think, and so same thing. I had the pleasure, or it was amazing to teach Kite Runner. I learned so much. I learned so much about even myself in terms of my own singular story of how I saw the world, and we need to tell those stories. But there's also those stories we don't know in our own towns.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Right, and so in some, so I don't want to say it's easier. That's not the right word, but we need to wrestle with both.
Yes.
What are the local stories that we need to be more aware of? What are the global stories we need to be more aware of? The national stories, like, I for myself, growing up in Canada, I knew so sadly and embarrassingly knew so little about the atrocities of residential schools and the Indigenous people. The atrocities, and you want to talk about an incomplete story, but that was such an incomplete story for me. And now looking back, being upset with myself, being sad and mad that those stories just weren't told. And again, and this is why I like the words that we've used in terms of the Indigenous story in Canada about truth and reconciliation. Reconciliation and restoration, of course, needs to be the goal. But can we get there without truth? And can we name those hard stories in our own community? Our own community. And they don't. And also the good stories. And I think you talked about this. Like, it doesn't just have to be the hard catastrophic stories. Like, how do we tell all stories and celebrate the good things too? But it needs to be both, and there needs to be depth and breadth to it.
Right. And what happens when our students only learn about African American history through the lens of slavery, right?
Yeah.
That too's a single story.
It's a single story.
And there's nuance that they can understand more, that there is more to that story.
Right. Yeah. So just, that's a good question.
No, and I guess, and in the end, then for me, as we're talking about, is just even like what's our deep hope for our students, right? So that, like we've used this quote by Wolterstorff before, this idea of like, hey, we want our students to engage and shape culture after they leave our institutions. We need to have them engage and shape culture, practice doing that while they're in our institutions. Well, if we want them to write a better story when they leave our schools, they need to know the stories, the other stories that they can participate in. There's not just one story where their gifts can be used. No, it's good. Folks, we want to thank you for being with us in the hallway today. We know that your time is valuable. As you head into this week, we just want to send you with a blessing. So to each of you, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace and give you peace and give you peace. Have a good week, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
This podcast was quite literally dreamed up during one of our actual hallway conversations. Our music is by Ethan Mulder. Hallway Conversations is an independent podcast created and produced by Matt Beamers, Abby DeGroat, and Dave Mulder. Thanks for listening.